Matt Collins had never been the type to embrace suburban life. He wasn't interested in neighborly chats over white picket fences, nor did he care about weekend barbecues where people fake friendliness while secretly competing over who had the best lawn. He had always lived in big cities, moving from place to place, never staying long enough to worry about community rules or the prying eyes of people who thrived on controlling others. When he finally purchased a home in what seemed like a quiet neighborhood, it wasn't because he longed for suburban camaraderie. It was because he wanted to escape the noise, the never-ending traffic, the feeling of being surrounded by people, yet feeling utterly alone. He wanted peace, solitude, the simple pleasure of being left undisturbed. His house was modest yet comfortable, a single-story home with a spacious backyard. One of the key reasons he chose it. He wasn't concerned with decorative landscaping or maintaining a perfect lawn, but he valued having an outdoor space where he could sit in the evenings, enjoy a cold beer, breathe in the fresh air without feeling caged in by concrete and city chaos. The first few days in his new home were exactly what he had imagined. The neighbors kept to themselves. He did the same. Occasionally, he exchanged greetings while jogging. He bumped into a few residents, most of whom were older retirees, uninterested in unnecessary interactions. This suited him perfectly. The last thing he wanted was to be pulled into the complicated social dynamics of suburban living. Then he met Karen, or rather, Karen made sure he knew who she was. It happened on a warm Friday evening, one of those rare moments where Matt allowed himself to relax after a grueling week of work. All he wanted was to sit in his backyard, drink a cold beer, let the exhaustion melt away. He had just settled into his patio chair, stretching his legs out, when he heard someone deliberately clearing their throat. He turned his head. There she was, standing beyond the fence, staring at him with disapproval. She appeared to be in her late 50s, with precisely styled blonde hair, wearing a pastel blouse that was immaculately pressed, her lips pressed into a firm line, arms crossed as she looked at him as though he had committed some serious offense. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the tone of authority. "Are you aware that alcohol is prohibited in outdoor spaces in this community?" Matt blinked, at first, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "What?" he said, his confusion evident. Karen sighed sharply, as if repeating herself was an inconvenience. "Alcohol is not allowed outdoors. It's in the community guidelines. You need to take that inside." Matt glanced at the beer in his hand. He wasn't throwing a party. He wasn't being loud. He was simply sitting in his own backyard, drinking one beer. He almost laughed, but could tell from her rigid stance that she was not joking. "I'm in my yard," he stated firmly. Karen exhaled sharply, as if the mere act of repeating herself was an inconvenience. "Alcohol is against the community guidelines. You need to follow the rules." Matt sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He had no patience for this. "Look, lady," he started. "Karen," she corrected. Her voice carried an air of authority. "I am the neighborhood compliance officer. It is my job to ensure that every resident follows the regulations." Matt clenched his jaw. The last thing he wanted was a confrontation, but he could already tell what kind of person she was. One of those people who thrived on having power over others, even if it was something as insignificant as enforcing minor neighborhood policies. He had met her type before, people who made it their mission to control everything around them, simply because it gave them a sense of superiority. He rubbed his temples. "Look, Karen, I am sitting in my backyard, drinking a single beer, not causing any trouble, not disturbing anyone. So if you don't mind, I would like to enjoy my evening in peace." Karen pursed her lips, her expression one of disapproval. "I do mind," she said, her voice sharp, "and I will have to report this. We take violations very seriously." Matt exhaled slowly, pressing his lips together to hold back his frustration. He had moved here to avoid unnecessary drama. Yet here he was, being lectured about drinking a beer on his own property. "Go ahead and report it," he said finally, lifting the bottle slightly in an exaggerated toast. "Knock yourself out." Karen's expression darkened. For a moment, he thought she might actually reach over the fence and snatch the bottle from his hand. Instead, she straightened her posture, lifted her chin, and pulled out her phone. "Well," she said, "if you were going to be difficult, I will have to take alternative measures. Matt rolled his eyes, turning his attention back to the setting sun. Do whatever you need to do, Karen. He heard her scoff in indignation before she marched off. He figured that was the end of it. He was wrong. 15 minutes later, flashing red and blue lights lit up the front of his house. Matt frowned, setting his beer down as he stood up, a feeling of unease settling in his stomach. He had an eerie suspicion of what was happening. As he walked towards the front door, he saw two police officers standing near their patrol car. His stomach sank. "Evening, officers, can I help you?" The older officer, a man with tired eyes, glanced at a notepad, then back at Matt. "We received a call about a disturbance. A neighbor reported a man drinking in public and acting disorderly." Matt exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I was drinking a beer in my backyard. That's it." The second officer, a younger guy, glanced toward the house, his expression neutral. "Your backyard?" "Yeah," Matt said, already feeling exhausted by the conversation. "My private property." The older officer nodded slowly, his face showing mild annoyance. "Right. Doesn't sound like an issue. Apologies for the inconvenience." Matt sighed in relief. At least someone here had common sense. Before they turned to leave, he glanced toward Karen's house. The curtains in her front window shifted. She was watching. He gritted his teeth, already knowing this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Matt should have known that Karen wouldn't let things go that easily. Women like her never did. The moment the cops left his driveway, he could already feel the storm brewing, an unshakable certainty that this was just the beginning of a much bigger headache. He had lived long enough to recognize the signs. People like Karen didn't get satisfaction from being told no. They took it as a personal challenge. And if there was one thing Matt had no patience for, it was playing games with someone who had nothing better to do with their life than dictate how others should live. He had hoped that the police visit would serve as a reality check for her, that she would realize she was wasting everyone's time. But as he stood on his porch, watching the squad car disappear down the street, he caught movement from the corner of his eye. Across the way, Karen stood by her front window, her silhouette visible behind the sheer curtains. She was watching him. The next morning, Matt found an envelope tucked neatly into his mailbox. There was no stamp, no return address, just his name written in sharp, precise letters. He already knew who it was from before he even opened it. Inside was a printed notice, the kind that was probably spit out of some outdated community association office printer. The language was formal, overly polite in a way that only made it more infuriating. "Dear Mr. Collins, it has come to our attention that you have engaged in behavior that is in direct violation of our community standards. As per the guidelines outlined in your welcome packet, the consumption of alcoholic beverages in outdoor spaces is strictly prohibited. This letter serves as an official warning. Repeated violations may result in fines or further action as deemed necessary by the association board. We encourage you to adhere to the established rules to maintain harmony within our neighborhood." Matt let out a dry laugh, shaking his head as he folded the letter and tossed it onto the kitchen counter. He had half a mind to walk over to Karen's house, knock on her door, tell her exactly where she could shove her official warning. But he knew that was exactly the kind of reaction she wanted. She wanted him angry, wanted to provoke him into an outburst, so she could run crying to the board or the police again. Play the victim. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. Instead, he decided to ignore it. Let her waste her time filing complaints. He wasn't breaking any actual laws. But ignoring Karen wasn't enough. That night, as Matt pulled into his driveway after a long day, something immediately felt off. It took him a moment to realize what it was. As soon as he stepped out of his car, he saw it. Trash. Pieces of paper, plastic wrappers, and an empty fast food bag scattered across his front lawn. At first, he thought maybe some raccoons had gotten into someone's garbage and the wind had carried it over. But as he got closer, he saw that the mess was too deliberate. The trash wasn't scattered randomly. It was placed. The wrappers were weighted down with small rocks, as if someone had made sure they wouldn't blow away before he could see them. Someone wanted him to know this was intentional. Karen. His jaw tightened as he exhaled slowly through his nose, forcing himself to stay calm. This was a petty move, juvenile at best, The logical part of his brain told him to just clean it up and move on. But another part of him, the part that didn't take kindly to being messed with, wanted to march over to her house and dump the trash right onto her perfectly manicured lawn. He settled for the first option, not because he was taking the high road, but because he knew this was just step one in whatever game she was playing. He wasn't going to react until he had something solid to use against her. The next morning, a second letter arrived. Another warning. This time it accused him of failing to maintain the cleanliness of his property, citing a section of the community guidelines that required all residents to keep their yards free of debris and litter. Matt almost laughed at the sheer audacity of it. Karen had manufactured a problem just so she could slap him with another warning. It was calculated, a move designed to frustrate him into compliance. But compliance to what? That was the part he still didn't understand. What did she actually want? For him to leave, to bend the knee and acknowledge her authority. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about a beer in his backyard. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules for the sake of order. She was enforcing them for the sake of power. She needed control, and Matt was a loose thread in the tapestry she had spent years weaving. He decided to talk to a few of the other neighbors, get a feel for whether this was something only he was dealing with, or if Karen had a habit of policing the entire street like some self-appointed sheriff. Most of them were hesitant to speak, offering vague, non-committal responses when he asked about the association's enforcement habits. But one man, an older guy named Tom, who lived a few houses down, gave him a look that said he knew exactly what Matt was dealing with. "She's been like this for years," Tom muttered, keeping his voice low as they stood by their mailboxes. "Most people just keep their heads down, follow the rules, don't make waves. But every now and then, someone moves in who doesn't fit her mold. Someone who doesn't bow to her little kingdom. And that's when the problems start." Matt frowned. "So what happens to those people?" Tom exhaled, shaking his head. "They leave. Sooner or later, they always leave. Either they get fed up with the fines and the harassment, or they start having real problems. Inspections, noise complaints, mysterious violations. Some of them swear things started happening to their property. Car tires slashed, sprinklers mysteriously broken. Nothing that could ever be traced back to her, of course, but enough to make life miserable." Matt let that sink in. He had dealt with difficult people before, but this was something else entirely. Karen wasn't just an annoying neighbor. She was playing the long game, and she had an entire system behind her to make sure she always won. "Let me guess," Matt said dryly. "No one's ever fought back." Tom gave a hollow chuckle. "You don't fight people like her, son. You outlast them, or you get out of their way." But Matt wasn't interested in waiting for Karen to get bored and move on to her next target. He wasn't going to roll over, and he sure as hell wasn't going to let her run him out of his own home. If she wanted to fight, she had picked the wrong guy. The next day, Matt installed security cameras around his property. If Karen wanted to play dirty, he would be ready. If there were more trash dumps, more violations, more mysteriously escalating issues, he would have proof of exactly who was behind them. He wasn't just going to endure her nonsense. He was going to document every single move she made. That night, he sat on his porch with another beer, looking straight toward Karen's house, taking a slow, deliberate sip. "Let's see what you do next, lady." Matt had known from the beginning that Karen wasn't going to let this go, but he hadn't expected her to escalate this quickly. The property inspection stunt had been her way of trying to show him that she had power, that she could make his life miserable with bureaucratic nonsense and official-looking documents. But when that failed, when he didn't fold like she expected him to, she had moved on to something more underhanded. He had expected fines, more letters, maybe even another visit from the police. But he hadn't expected her to start sending people onto his property in the middle of the night. The broken glass, the threatening note, those weren't just warnings. They were declarations of war. But if Karen thought intimidation tactics were going to work on him, she had severely miscalculated. Matt had dealt with worse than petty suburban tyrants. And if she was trying to push him out, she had picked the wrong man to mess with. He spent the next morning securing his property. The cameras he had installed were already good, but he upgraded the angles, repositioned a few, made sure they covered every vulnerable spot. He reinforced the locks on his fence gates, added motion-sensitive floodlights near the back. Even placed a few discreet noise sensors along the perimeter. If anyone so much as stepped onto his lawn without his permission again, he would know. Then he started digging. If Karen wanted to play games, he needed to understand exactly how far her influence reached. He wasn't interested in fighting blind. He went through public records, searching for complaints, lawsuits, or anything that tied her to shady tactics. While there was nothing outright damning, there was a pattern. People moving in, people moving out. Too many houses in the community had been bought and sold within a suspiciously short time frame. Some after only a year or two. That wasn't normal for a suburban neighborhood. People usually settled in for the long haul. But here, the turnover rate was too high to be a coincidence. Matt started talking to people. At first, most of them were reluctant to say anything. Some acted like they barely knew Karen, brushing off his questions with polite smiles and vague answers. Others lowered their voices, glanced over their shoulders before speaking, as if they were afraid that simply acknowledging the problem would make them the next target. And then there were the ones who talked. A man down the street, retired, widowed, told him that he had been fined so many times for minor infractions that he had eventually just given up and paid thousands of dollars in penalties, even though half of them were bogus. A younger couple admitted that they had been pressured into repainting their house 3 times in a single year because it didn't match the aesthetic guidelines, even though other homes had the exact same colors. A woman who had lived there for over a decade confessed that she had watched 3 different families pack up and leave under mysterious circumstances, all of them citing stress, harassment, endless citations for nonsense violations. Karen had been systematically driving people out, and the worst part was that no one had ever stopped her. Matt knew why. Fear, not of physical violence, not of anything that would make the news, but the kind of fear that settled into your daily life, grinding you down little by little until you were too exhausted to keep fighting. Constant fines, false complaints, property devaluations, endless bureaucracy. She didn't need to threaten people outright. She just had to make them feel like staying wasn't worth it. And now she was trying to do the same thing to him. That night, Matt sat on his porch, waiting. He had no proof that Karen had sent the person who vandalized his fence. But he didn't need proof to know it was her doing. He wasn't stupid. He also knew she would try again. So when his cameras alerted him to movement in his yard, he was already prepared. A shadow moved along the fence line, creeping low, trying to stay out of sight. But the motion sensors caught them, the floodlights snapping on in an instant, bathing the entire yard in harsh white light. The figure froze. Matt stepped out onto his porch, arms crossed, watching as the intruder, a man in his mid-30s, dressed in dark clothes, stood there, caught like a rat in a trap. "Something I can help you with." Matt's voice was calm, steady, not the least bit surprised. The man hesitated, glancing toward the street, like he was considering making a run for it. Matt took a step forward. "I think carefully about your next move. I've got 4 different cameras recording you right now. And if you so much as move in the wrong direction, that footage is going straight to the police." The man swallowed, his atoms apple bobbing. He wasn't just some random thug. He was nervous, unsure. He hadn't expected to be caught. And then, in a low voice, he said, "I was just supposed to leave something." Matt narrowed his eyes. "Let me guess. A bottle. A note. Maybe another little warning." The man didn't answer. Matt shook his head. "Tell Karen she's getting sloppy." That did it. The man flinched, his face twisting into something between guilt and frustration. But Matt didn't care about his excuses. "Get the hell off my property," Matt said, his voice firm. "And if I see you or anyone else here again, I won't be so polite next time." The man didn't need to be told twice. He turned and bolted, disappearing down the street. Matt exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. He hadn't expected Karen to send someone again so soon. But it didn't matter. She had made her move, and now it was his turn. The next morning, Matt made a call. Not to the police. He knew they wouldn't do much with so little direct evidence. No. He called a lawyer. Someone who specialized in property disputes and wrongful harassment. Someone who could help him do what no one else had done before. Fight back with actual legal consequences. Karen had gotten away with her tactics for too long, because no one had ever put real pressure on her. But Matt wasn't just another name on a list. Another resident who would roll over and leave. He wasn't going anywhere. And this time, Karen was going to learn exactly what it felt like to lose. Matt had spent his life handling problems head-on. But there was something different about this. This wasn't a confrontation he could settle with a single decisive move. Not a fight where one good hit would end things. This was slow, insidious, a war of attrition, designed to drain him, to make him doubt whether any of this was worth it. Karen wasn't coming at him directly, and that was what made her dangerous. She wasn't the type to get her hands dirty. She worked through systems, through loopholes, through technicalities and rules that had just enough legal backing to be a nightmare to challenge. She had built a fortress of bureaucracy, and the only way to beat someone like that was to start dismantling it from the inside. He had spent the last few days reinforcing his property, making sure no one could step foot on his land without him knowing about it. The cameras had already paid off once, when they caught the man sneaking around his fence. And now, Matt had hard evidence. Karen wasn't just some overzealous neighborhood busybody. She was orchestrating something, whether it was harassment, intimidation, or a deliberate attempt to drive him out. It didn't matter. The fact that she was willing to send people in the dead of night to mess with his property told him that this wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was personal. He started digging deeper, going through everything he could find about Karen and her grip on the community. The association's bylaws were intentionally convoluted, a maze of legal jargon that made it nearly impossible to tell what was actually enforceable and what was just posturing. But buried in the mess of rules and regulations, Matt found something interesting. A clause stating that board members could be legally removed if they were found guilty of abuse of power, manipulation, or intimidation of residents. It was vague, and he knew the process would be anything but simple. But it was a crack in the wall she had built around herself. And a crack was all he needed. The more he talked to his neighbors, the more he realized just how long Karen had been playing this game. Some were reluctant to speak, their eyes darting around as if saying the wrong thing might bring some unseen consequence down on them. Others, the ones who had been through the worst of her games, were more willing to share their stories. A retired couple who had been fined into submission. A single mother who had been repeatedly accused of violations she never committed. A man who had been slapped with noise complaints simply because his dog barked twice in a day. And then there were the ones who had left. The families who had packed up and moved, after months, sometimes years, of constant battles with Karen and her relentless enforcement of rules that seemed to exist solely to drive people away. Patterns began to emerge. Clear, undeniable connections between who stayed and who left, between who was quietly tolerated and who became a target. Karen didn't just go after people at random. She focused on the ones she couldn't control, the independent types, the ones who didn't fall in line, the ones who didn't play along with the charade of community harmony she had built around herself. If someone wasn't willing to bend to her will, she broke them in other ways, through fines, through restrictions, through the slow, grinding process of making life so frustrating, so exhausting, that leaving felt like the only option. Matt wasn't about to let that happen to him. He started documenting everything, every interaction, every letter, every ridiculous fine and attempted harassment. He saved security footage, took screenshots of messages, logged every single conversation with his neighbors that confirmed her long history of targeted intimidation. He knew that winning against someone like Karen wasn't just about proving she was wrong. It was about proving that she was a liability. People like her thrived because they made themselves appear untouchable. But even the most untouchable people had weak points. And Karen's weak point was power. She didn't just enjoy controlling the neighborhood. She needed to control it. It wasn't about enforcing rules. It was about enforcing her version of order. So Matt started hitting her where it hurt. He gathered signatures, carefully and quietly, reaching out to the people who had been wronged by her the most. He didn't lead with anger or accusations. He led with logic, with facts, with a clear and legal pathway to removing her from power. He laid it all out piece by piece, explaining that this wasn't just about him, that anyone in this neighborhood could be next, if Karen decided they didn't fit her standards. And little by little, people started to listen. He knew Karen would catch wind of it sooner or later. She had eyes everywhere. And sure enough, it didn't take long for the pushback to start. The sudden, inexplicable fines for things that had never been issues before. The anonymous complaints about his property. His car. The way he parked in his own driveway. The warnings that if he continued to disrupt the harmony of the community, he could face more severe consequences. It was laughable, really, how transparent it all was. But Karen wasn't just relying on technicalities anymore. She was getting desperate. One night, as Matt checked his security footage, he caught movement near his front door. A figure, hooded, staying just out of range of the brighter lights, but still visible enough that he could make out what they were holding. A bucket. The moment he saw the motion, he was already moving. He threw the door open, just as the figure raised their arm, ready to splash something against his house. The pungent smell of paint thinner hit him instantly. Even before the first drops hit the pavement, the figure froze for just a second, long enough for Matt to step forward. "Wrong house," Matt said coldly. The figure hesitated, for a fraction of a second, before dropping the bucket and running. Matt didn't bother chasing them. He didn't need to. The camera had caught everything. By the time he reviewed the footage, he wasn't surprised by what he found. The person hadn't been some random vandal, some bored teenager messing around. No, this had been deliberate, calculated. And even though the hood obscured their face, Matt recognized the build. The way they moved. One of Karen's people. She had escalated to property damage. That was her mistake. Matt had been playing defense, waiting for her to push too far, to make a mistake that could actually cost her something. And now she had. This wasn't just about harassment anymore. This was criminal. Matt wasn't going to report it to the association. He wasn't going to file a complaint through her rig system. No. This time, he was going over her head, because Karen had finally crossed the line that would end her reign for good. The next morning, Matt went straight to the police. He wasn't expecting much, not because the crime wasn't serious, but because he knew how these things usually went. Without a clear face in the video footage, there was always the chance that it would be dismissed as not enough evidence, or that the case would get buried under more pressing matters. But he also knew that this wasn't just about one act of vandalism. This was part of a pattern, a targeted campaign of harassment and intimidation. And patterns were something law enforcement actually took seriously. He sat across from a detective, laying out everything he had: the security footage, the threatening letters, the manufactured violations, the false reports. He didn't just present it as a single incident. He framed it as a coordinated effort to push him out of his home. An ongoing campaign of deliberate abuse. He knew better than to expect immediate action. But he could tell by the way the detective's expression shifted, by the way they started taking actual notes, instead of just nodding along, that he had struck a nerve. That was the thing about people like Karen. They were incredibly careful. Until they weren't. They knew how to manipulate rules, how to work within systems. But eventually, they always got greedy. They always pushed too far, believing that their control was absolute. But control was only absolute until someone exposed the cracks, until someone refused to back down, and made them feel the weight of their own actions. When he left the station, he wasn't sure what would come of the report. But he knew one thing for certain. Karen had overplayed her hand, and she knew it too, because the next escalation came fast. 2 days later, a notice of emergency board action was posted on his front door. It was a formal letter, filled with legal jargon and vague language. But the message was clear. He was now under special review for repeated violations and disturbances within the community. It was nonsense, of course. There were no specific charges, no actual incidents listed, just a blanket statement about how his behavior had been detrimental to the peaceful enjoyment of the neighborhood, and that he would need to attend a mandatory hearing to determine potential disciplinary measures. Karen was trying to put on a show. She wasn't just looking for a way to punish him. She wanted to humiliate him, to drag him into a public spectacle where she could control the narrative. She wanted him to sit in a room full of people while she listed off every so-called violation, every trumped-up complaint, every ridiculous fine, and make him look like the problem. She wanted him to break in front of everyone. But Matt wasn't walking into a trap without a plan. He spent the next few days gathering his own evidence, making sure that when the hearing came, he would be prepared. He pulled every single fabricated violation, every piece of proof that showed the selective enforcement of rules. And most importantly, the long history of similar harassment against other residents. He didn't just want to defend himself. He wanted to dismantle the entire foundation Karen had built. When the day of the hearing arrived, he walked into the meeting room, calm, collected, fully prepared for war. Karen sat at the head of the long conference table, flanked by her usual allies. The board members who had either been too weak to challenge her or too complicit to care. She had that same smug expression, the one she always wore when she thought she had already won. "Mr. Collins," she began, her tone sickeningly formal, "we appreciate you taking the time to join us today to address the numerous concerns that have been raised regarding your conduct in the community." Matt didn't respond. He just sat back, arms crossed, watching her. She hesitated for half a second, just a flicker of uncertainty, but then pushed forward. She laid out the case against him, going through a ridiculous list of offenses that were so absurd, so blatantly fabricated, that it took everything in Matt not to laugh. Excessive noise complaints, unauthorized modifications to his property, failure to comply with community guidelines. One by one, she listed them off, painting a picture of him as some unruly, disruptive force that had been terrorizing the neighborhood. And when she finally finished, waiting for him to get defensive, waiting for him to lash out, Matt did the one thing she hadn't expected. He smiled. Then he pulled out his own stack of papers. "That was quite a speech," he said, his voice calm. "But now let's talk about facts." And then he started going through everything. The inconsistencies in the violations, the pattern of targeted harassment, the clear, documented evidence of how the rules were only enforced against specific people, the security footage of the vandalism attempt, the anonymous reports that conveniently disappeared whenever they didn't serve Karen's interests. And then finally, he pulled out the signatures, dozens of them, from residents who had been too afraid to speak up before, but who had in private confirmed everything he was saying. Karen's expression cracked. The room went silent. The board members who had been so confident at the start of the meeting were now exchanging uneasy glances, suddenly realizing that this wasn't the controlled, one-sided attack they had expected. This wasn't just a resident defending himself. This was an exposure of the entire system they had let Karen build. And then Matt delivered the final blow. "Now," he said, leaning forward slightly, "we could continue this hearing. Or we could talk about the legal implications of everything I just presented. Because I have already filed an official report with law enforcement. And I have more than enough evidence to take this beyond just a neighborhood dispute." Karen's face went pale. Because she knew that if this went any further, she wasn't just going to lose control. She was going to lose everything. For the first time since this whole thing had started, she was the one on defense. And Matt, he was just getting started. Karen had built her power on the assumption that no one would ever fight back. Every ridiculous fine, every fabricated violation, every carefully orchestrated campaign of pressure had been designed to make people feel like they had no choice but to comply or leave. She had gotten away with it for years, bullying residents into submission, using the system as a weapon, and ensuring that anyone who stood against her quickly realized they were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and out of options. But this time, she had miscalculated. This time, she had picked a fight with someone who wasn't going to fold. The board meeting had been the turning point, the moment where her carefully crafted illusion of control had finally started to crumble. The expressions on the faces of the board members, the way they had shifted uncomfortably as Matt laid out his case, the sudden absence of the smug certainty that Karen usually radiated. It had been the first real crack in her armor, and cracks only got bigger under pressure. Matt had expected her to retaliate in some way, to try and salvage what was left of her authority. But even he hadn't expected how desperate she would become, because when she realized that she could no longer win within the system she had built, she abandoned it completely. She stopped pretending. The next day, Matt found a letter in his mailbox. Not an official notice. Not one of the usual printed warnings with letterhead and formal language. Just a single sheet of paper, folded once, with his name scrawled on the front in rushed handwriting. Inside it read, "You think you've won. You have no idea what you started. There was no signature, no direct threat, just that single ominous sentence. But Matt didn't need a signature to know exactly who had written it. Karen had finally dropped the act. Most people would have gone straight to the police, reported the note, demanded action. But Matt knew better. Karen was careful. She had always been careful. A single letter wasn't enough to get her in real trouble. Not yet. But it was proof that she was cracking, that she was starting to lose control. And that meant she was dangerous. Not in the sense that she would do something outright violent. That wasn't her style. She wasn't the kind of person who got her hands dirty. But she was the kind of person who would do everything in her power to make his life unbearable. She had spent years perfecting the art of manipulation, of pushing people to the edge without ever putting herself in direct jeopardy. But this time, she had made one critical mistake. She had underestimated him. Matt didn't react to the letter. He didn't change his routine, didn't acknowledge it. He let Karen sit with the uncertainty. Let her wonder if he had even seen it, or if he was just waiting for the right moment to strike back. The power shift was already happening. The board members who had once backed her blindly were suddenly less enthusiastic, less willing to take her side without question. Some of them had even started avoiding her entirely. They had seen what Matt was capable of, and they didn't want to be caught in the crossfire. And then came the final step, the petition. Matt had spent weeks gathering support, quietly but effectively. And now, with enough signatures, he was filing the official request for Karen's removal from the Homeowners Association board. It was a long shot. He knew that, but it wasn't impossible. And the very act of filing it meant that Karen's reputation was now under official scrutiny. The process would take time. There would be hearings, votes, legal reviews. But it was already in motion, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. That night, as he sat on his porch, drinking a beer, in full view of her house, he saw her silhouette behind the window, watching. For the first time since this all started, she wasn't the one in control. She was the one waiting, dreading what came next. And Matt, he was just getting started. The first hearing was scheduled for the following week. Matt knew Karen would fight it. She wasn't the type to go down quietly. She had built her power over years of manipulation. She wasn't going to let it slip away without a struggle. But Matt wasn't backing down either. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person she had bullied, every resident who had been fined into submission, every homeowner who had packed up and left because they were too exhausted to fight back. Karen had ruled through fear, but fear only worked if people believed they were alone. And now, for the first time, she was the one standing alone. When Matt arrived at the hearing, he wasn't surprised to see that Karen had stacked the room with her supporters. The people who still believed in her authority, who had benefited from her selective enforcement, who saw her not as a tyrant, but as a protector of their ideal community. But he had supporters too, more than he had expected. People who had once been too afraid to speak up, but who had, over the past few weeks, found their voices. People who had been waiting for someone to stand up to her. The board members sat at the front of the room, their expressions neutral, but Matt could see the unease in their eyes. They knew this wasn't just another petty complaint. This was a battle for control. Karen opened the hearing with her usual confidence, spinning a narrative of how she had only ever acted in the best interest of the community. How Matt was the real problem, a troublemaker, someone who had disrupted the harmony they had worked so hard to maintain. She spoke with the same arrogance she always had. But this time, it didn't land the way she expected. Because this time, Matt had proof. He didn't argue with her, didn't get drawn into her games. Instead, he simply presented the facts, the pattern of harassment, the fabricated violations, the selective targeting of residents, the security footage, the letters, the signatures from those who had been wronged by her over the years. It was all there, laid out for everyone to see. And as he spoke, he saw the shift, the moment when even some of her most loyal supporters started to doubt. The moment when Karen herself realized that she had lost control of the room. For the first time, Karen didn't have a response. She sat there, her lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers gripping the papers in front of her so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The board members exchanged glances, uncomfortable with the weight of the evidence Matt had just laid out. Some of them had been blindly following Karen for years, trusting her leadership without question. But now, Faced with the undeniable truth, they couldn't ignore what was happening. The room was silent. The authority Karen had always wielded was slipping away, and she knew it. Matt leaned back in his chair, calm, collected. He had done what he came to do. He had exposed her. Now it was up to the board to make a decision. One of the senior board members cleared his throat. "Thank you, Mr. Collins, for bringing these concerns to our attention," he said, carefully choosing his words. "We will review the evidence and make a decision regarding the future of Ms. Karen's position on the board." Karen opened her mouth as if to protest, but for the first time, no one was listening to her. The meeting was dismissed. People stood up, murmuring amongst themselves, and Karen remained seated, staring blankly at the table. Matt walked past her without saying a word. There was nothing left to say. Over the next few days, the tension in the neighborhood was thick. Karen didn't make any more attempts to retaliate. No more anonymous letters. No more bogus violations. It was as if she had finally realized that the battle was over. And then, one morning, a new notice was posted on the community bulletin board. Effective immediately, Karen was being removed from her position as compliance officer. The decision had been made. The board had voted. She had lost. Matt stood there, reading the words, letting them sink in. He had done it. He had fought back and won. As he turned to walk away, he saw Karen standing on her porch, watching from a distance. Her expression unreadable. For years, she had controlled this neighborhood with an iron grip. And now, she was just another resident. No power. No influence. Just another person trying to live her life. And Matt, he had finally gotten exactly what he wanted. Peace. A week later, Matt sat in his backyard. The sun was setting, casting warm golden hues across the sky. A cool breeze rustled the leaves, carrying the distant hum of the neighborhood. Peaceful, quiet, just the way he had always wanted. He took a slow sip of his beer, stretching his legs out, letting the moment settle in. For the first time since moving here, he felt at ease. No letters, no threats, no ridiculous violations waiting in his mailbox. Karen had gone completely silent. Word had spread that she had officially stepped down from the board. Whether she had done so willingly or been pressured into it, Matt didn't know. And honestly, he didn't care. She had lost her power, and that was all that mattered. He had expected her to put up one last fight, to find some desperate way to claw back control, but she hadn't. Maybe she had finally realized that she had pushed too far. Or maybe, without her position, she simply didn't have the energy to keep going. Either way, she was done. And Matt, he was free. He glanced across the street toward her house. For the first time, her curtains were drawn. No prying eyes watching his every move. No shadow lingering at the window. It was almost as if she had finally accepted defeat. He exhaled slowly, taking in the quiet victory. This wasn't just about winning against her. It was about proving that people like Karen didn't have absolute control. That no matter how much power they thought they had, there was always a way to fight back. He had refused to be bullied, refused to be driven out of his own home. And now, he had exactly what he had fought for. His space, his peace, his freedom. The sound of laughter echoed from down the street. Neighbors, relaxed and at ease, enjoying the evening without the weight of Karen's rule hanging over them. Matt smiled to himself. He had made a difference, not just for himself, but for everyone else who had suffered under her reign. He leaned back in his chair, lifting his beer in a silent toast to the quiet life he had fought so hard to reclaim. And for the first time since moving here, he truly felt at home.